Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, tomorrow in Washington, they're opening the city's newest museum. It's one which is dedicated to the victims of communism. This is quite germane to my guest this week, James Bartholomew. He's been on the channel before, the author and journalist, is at the forefront of an effort to build a similar museum in Britain. He's also a trustee of the Foundation for the History of Totalitarianism. Thank you very much for joining us, James.
Pleasure.
First of all, first things first, you recently wrote about buying a tank, or rather should I say the Institute for History of Totalitarianism bought a tank. What kind of tank did you buy and why?
We bought a T-55 Soviet tank, which is relevant to what we're doing because it is the tank that was used to suppress, well, there were two versions. There was a T-54 and the T-55. They're more or less the same. The T-54 was used in the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 against the communist regime then. It was also used to suppress the Prague Spring. The Russian T-55s came in, and they were. You see pictures of that suppression, and those are the tanks that were used. And then again, a copy of the tank, a Chinese copy, was used in Tiananmen Square. The famous photo of the man with the bag, who was standing in front of a column of tanks. The T-55s were used at Tiananmen as well. So it has a long history of being part of repression by totalitarian regimes.
But so the foundation bought the tank. Can I ask how much it cost? I mean,
It cost about, in pounds, it was about 68,500.
Really?
But on top of that, you have to pay for the transport, which is over another 10,000. And then we've got to pay for the decommissioning, which has just taken place today in Kent.
All right.
It was already previously decommissioned to EU standards, but this is one instance where the British standards were actually higher, and it has had to be decommissioned to British standards.
Right. Now, where is this tank going to end up if everything goes to plan?
Well, ideally, where it would ultimately end up would be in a museum in London.
Right.
For the time being, it's going to go into storage in Kent. And there is a possibility, to put it no higher, that there may be an exhibition of some sort in Kent in due course.
Right.
But that's by no means certain. Part of the idea of buying the tank is to pump prime a museum.
Yeah.
So, we bought lots of artifacts. We've got KGB prison door. We've got a desk, a KGB desk. We've got various Nazi artifacts. We've got a letter from a prisoner at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. We've got this variety of artifacts. We're building up more and more and more. We are just trying to increase the credibility of the idea that this could become a museum. We're almost making it so it's almost ready-made.
Yes, yes.
We've got a lot of what's necessary for a museum, and we just need the right, extremely rich donor to come along and say, okay, I'll buy you a London building and pay for the creation of a museum, and let's go. So that's the idea. We also do an essay prize for sixth formers. So that gets ideas into the schools and people when they're first learning about how things work, to get in there, get the ideas across. The next subject will be the Hungarian Revolution of '56, and the previous subject was the Stasi. We've also previously done Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to go into Auschwitz. Right. Astonishing man. So well, that's our other main activities so far, but we have other plans to do more activities in due course.
We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, but just to focus a bit on the museum at the moment, the Museum of Communist Terror is what it would be called, is that right?
No, well, there are two separate organisations. One is the Foundation for the History of Totalitarianism, which has its own board, its own mandate, which deals with fascism as well as communism in the 20th century. The Museum of Communist Terror, which was a previously made organisation, that deals exclusively with communism.
Right.
So they overlap. Obviously, their missions overlap, but they are separate and they have different, aims and methods of going about their business.
Right. In terms of museums, I've been to the very impressive one in Budapest. I think it's called the House of Terror, isn't it? And that has a huge tank, doesn't it? It's very, very effective. All these pictures of people who were killed, actually under Nazism and communism in it. Is there a lot of support for the idea here in Britain?
It's divided. So, some people who say this and they mention this too, and they think, "What on earth for? Would anybody go?" But that House of Terror, which you mentioned, which, as you say, covers both the Nazi time ruling in Budapest and the Soviet time, is very successful. It often has queues outside. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has vast queues outside, and school parties. So I believe there is a demand for it, and I think it is such an extraordinary thing that happened in the 20th century, that these vast totalitarian powers grew up and were accountable for either viciously cruel deaths or else as millions and millions of deaths. I mean, most people in this country sadly know much more about one than they know about the other. So people have much more knowledge about the Nazi regime and how bad and evil it was than they do about life under the communist regimes, which accounted. I mean, the Holocaust was a particularly grotesque crime, but under communism, the numbers are actually much bigger. We're talking about 80 to 100 million people dying of starvation, execution, just immeasurably harsh conditions, lack of medicine. I mean, 80 to 100 million, that is an extraordinary event, and yet it is very little covered in our educational system.
Now, tell us a bit about that. Well, first of all, I mean, we've done research here at the NCF about young people's ideas about communism, or indeed their knowledge, even just their knowledge, and it was sort of lamentable, really. What is the problem, as you see it, between the way in which communism is taught, if at all, and other history is taught?
Well, the first problem with history overall is that only 45% of young people actually do it for GCSE at all.
Right.
So we're talking about ignorance of history altogether. We're trying to create citizens of the future who know very little about the past, which seems to me crazy. The subject has been quite wrongly downgraded in Britain. But even if you do it, and I've got one here, the Nazi experience and the Soviet history are told in completely different ways.
Right.
I think of it as being like the difference between commentating on a football match and a moral view. So when it comes to telling the Nazi story, it's very much a moral view. And I've got here one of the revision and practice books that is available for children to doing GCSE. And it has in its opening pages, in the summary, it's got Germany 1890 to 1945. Perfectly fair subject. These are all perfectly fair subjects. And it's got under it, as one of the main categories, the experiences of Germans under the Nazis, 1933 to 1939. It's got the machinery of terror, and it goes into detail about how people were terrified. They were not allowed to say things, or they'd be arrested or tortured or killed. Their racial policy. So it goes into detail about how the evil and horrible experience that people had under the Nazis. And so you come away from that knowing how bad the Nazis were and how horrible it was for people living under it. And you turn to so that's what I call the moral approach to history. Then you go to the Soviet Union, and it's completely different. It is superpower relations and the Cold War. So it's not about the experience of people in the communist countries. It is the origins of the Cold War crises, the end of the Cold War. It's basically treating the communist bloc and the West as if they were two rival football teams, playing. Sometimes one team played well and the other team played badly. Stalin, scored well with this particular tactic, or did well here or there, or it's like a game. The morality of it is non-existent. The experience of people in the Soviet Union is not mentioned. the experience of people in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, in Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, who had communism imposed on them, not mentioned. Now, I'm sure that history is taught by some of the best teachers, in my view. I'm prejudiced because I read history, but I think some of the best teachers there are historians. And I don't blame them. What I blame is the focus. The one is focused on the football match approach, and one is on the moral approach.
Well, why would you say there is that difference?
I mean, who knows? I can't say for sure, but I suspect this is because in the academic world generally, certainly among the higher academics in universities, there has been a preponderance of people who have had some sympathy with the left-wing views or extreme left-wing views, and have had no sympathy with Nazi or fascist views. And there's been a disproportionate, and so they are very happy to concentrate on what happened under the Nazis, but they're much less happy going into detail about what happened to people in the Soviet Union and other communist countries. And of course, the biggest number of deaths took place in China, and that is just not on the, not mentioned in this book at all.
In fact, I remember when we were discussing this before we came on, you had some pretty sobering statistics about, for example, the knowledge of Chairman Mao amongst people.
Yes, I mean, this is from your own research, that 70% of young people have never even heard of Chairman Mao. I mean, the ignorance is stunning. And, I do think that it's a failure of our educational system that the man responsible for more deaths personally in the 20th century than anybody else is unheard of. Extraordinary failure. And then at the same time, there is a bit of a sympathy for communism, because another recent poll showed that 38% of young adults, a bit older than the cohort you looked at, think that communism could have worked if done better.
Isn't that one of the oldest ones in the book, that they always use that as a cop-out? I mean, in discussions you've had, our political arguments we've all had, that yes, you're quite right, it was terrible, but that's because it wasn't done properly.
Yes, but what makes it even more extraordinary to me is that you have 70% have never heard of Chairman Mao, but 38% say that communism could have worked if it were done better. Now, they're combining, there is an overlap there of people who haven't heard of Chairman Mao and think communism could have worked. So they combine historical ignorance of an extraordinary extent, and with believing it could have worked. Now, I try to avoid propaganda as such, because I think it's unnecessary and counterproductive. I just want young people, to know the facts, to know the history, to know the story. Then they can make up their own mind. If they still think, after studying the over 20 times that communist regimes have been attempted, they still think that it could work with a tweak here, or they're cleverer than Lenin or cleverer than Mao, then fine, let them make that decision. But let them at least know the story before they draw conclusions that without any foundation of knowledge.
Also, I get the impression that, I don't have data or anything, but the teachers who teach them are pretty ignorant too.
Yes, well, I mean, inevitably they went through the educational system. And so yes, they start off with less knowledge, but historians history teachers are always learning. I mean, one of the great things about history teachers is that they are more open-minded than average. They're more willing to listen to one argument and another argument. That's part of the training of being a historian, and that's so I don't regard that as doomed at all. They can learn more, and they do learn more, and then they develop their own enthusiasms, and there is some flexibility, thank goodness, in the British system for choosing subjects that the teacher thinks is important.
So you mentioned, before we discussed that, you mentioned about some of the initiatives that the foundation actually offers in terms of, the learning of history. I mean, you mentioned the Hungarian Revolution. How would that actually work? Is it it's a competition, is it? Or?
Yes, I mean, these days, students are all competing to have a good personal statement. So it's not good enough to get lots of good A-levels. You've got to have a good personal statement that shows you've done interesting and different things. One of the things they do is to do essays, to compete in essay prizes. So we have an essay prize, an annual essay prize, and the subject this coming year, in the next academic year, for sixth formers, will be the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. That means inevitably that some hundreds of students will begin at least to learn about the Hungarian Revolution, what led them to create the revolution and how it was put down. So they will inevitably learn a lot about that, what took place, one particular part in detail. And over 100 of them will actually produce essays of very high quality, over 2,000 words, of 2,000 words, and they will know in depth, they will know better than I do, what took place and why.
Well, is this open to all sixth formers?
All sixth formers in the UK, yes.
Right.
I mean, we would consider essays from outside the UK, but it's primarily designed for students in the UK.
James, this is, so many people watching will be thinking this is exactly what we need, whether it's from the educational point of view or indeed from a material museum point of view. Why did you get involved? What was your passion?
I think there's a long history. So sometimes there's a catalytic moment when you suddenly think, yes, this is what I must do. But it's been built up over a lifetime. I'm old enough to have lived through the Cold War and to have travelled through the Soviet Union as it then was. I mean, I travelled from Peking or Beijing to back to London in 1982. I travelled through Irkutsk, stopped in Irkutsk, stopped in Moscow, stopped in Bucharest, stopped in Belgrade. So I spent weeks doing this, and then that really brought home to me what these regimes were like. And whereas I had thought in principle these regimes are A, economically unsuccessful, and B, politically oppressive, I had much more evidence for that. I had direct evidence. I met somebody in Irkutsk just walking around who spoke a bit of English, and he's a nice guy. I thought, come back to my hotel. Very naive I was. Come back to my hotel. We'll have supper, and I wanted to develop the relationship and hear what he had to say. We sat down to supper at the hotel. Now, the hotel, of course, was an official hotel available for foreign tourists that was run by the state, by the Soviet state. Foreigners were only allowed to go in specified hotels. So it was called the in-tourist hotel. I now know that every person who works in an in-tourist hotel had to report to the KGB. And the KGB probably had an office in the hotel as well. Anyway, we sat down to supper. And the waitress came up to us and started speaking to my friend in Russian. I couldn't understand what they were saying. And he then got up as if to leave. And I said, what's happening? Why are you leaving? He said, apparently 2 men have come to talk to me. So he left, and I never saw him again.
Really?
And that sort of thing makes you realize that this really is a police state, where you're not allowed to talk to foreigners, and if you do, you're in trouble. I just hope to God that that man did not come to any serious harm and merely was asked to report on exactly what I'd asked him. But it's when you come up to it face to face like that, it's scary, and you can begin to empathize a little more easily with what it was like for people living in that day by day by day.
As part of your work, you've actually collected some testimonies, have you not, from people of their experiences? I mean, what is the broad range of testimonies you've got? Are they from all different regimes, or?
Yes, this is from for the Museum of Communist Terror. I've recorded at least 35 interviews with people who experienced communism directly, and I must say that has been one of the most rewarding and fascinating parts of my work. Some of these appear on the Museum of Communist Terror YouTube channel, and I find them extraordinarily moving. One of them is with a survivor of the Gulag. There are not many of them around now, and she's 96 years old, and she was sent to Kolyma, which is a notorious area where temperatures reached -40. They weren't supposed to send people out when the temperature got below -40, but sometimes it'd be -40 at the beginning, and then it'd be -45 by the time when they were out working, and they would stay out. The treatment she received is horrific, and it's very, very moving. And I think one of the things I found most extraordinary about these interviews, because I've interviewed people who were from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Albania, from Hungary, the Czechoslovakia as it then was. One of the most extraordinary things is the way you see when they become upset. You know, these people have been through terrible experiences. Ivana, who was in the Gulag, she was tortured. And people who've talked to have been tortured, sometimes horrifically. But that's not, when they recollect that, that's not what upsets them. There's one woman who had been sent, who said some criticism about the famine in China. And she was sent to a forced labour for 10 years throughout her entire 20s. She made a remark to a friend in private that maybe the government could have done better with regard to the Great Famine. She made a remark in private, as a result spent 10 years forced labour. And she wasn't upset talking about that. What upset her was when she repeated that her mother had come to visit the prison and that she'd put herself in danger by doing so. In other words, what upset her was the memory that her mother loved her.
Yes.
And that's what brings tears to people's eyes when they recall. That's nothing is more important to people than the love that other people showed for them.
It is extraordinarily moving, and to go back to the original point, this is so few people would know about this, or should I say young people, and it might seem superficial, but I don't think it is, in a way that, quite rightly, if you look at where a lot of young people get their history now, it is through films and drama, and quite rightly so, and the Third Reich and the war is very well represented in that. Almost nothing, unless you can tell me otherwise, James, there are no drama series about Stalin. There are no films particularly about what happened in China or Russia. Certainly not Western films, are there?
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in those films, and funnily enough, the most visited part of the website of the Museum of Communist Terror is the list of 10 films about communism. And every time a new one is made, I become very interested and excited about it and hope it'll be good.
Yes.
Sometimes they are pretty disappointing, I have to say. But there's been one recent one that's Mr. Jones,
right,
which is pretty good in my view. It's about one Welsh journalist who didn't take the lies that were being told about there not being a famine in Ukraine, and went down to Ukraine by train, against the wishes of the people in charge of him, and got off and found there was a famine there and reported on it. Gareth Jones, Welsh journalist, outstanding guy, and so that there are occasional films, and it's a matter of personal opinion which you think are the best. I think probably still The Killing Fields is the best one about communism.
Yeah.
Chernobyl was a terrific series, not directly about communism, but such high quality, and it reflects some aspects of communism. There are various films about it, mostly not about China, and that's a bit of a omission. But there are some Chinese films which are a bit more hard to access. But anyway, 10 films that are well worth watching are on our website.
Do you have the lives of others on there?
Absolutely.
Yes, I think
absolutely.
That's definitely one of them. You offer these competitions and for essays, James. But I mean, as in a broader sense, how do you see the situation changing vis-a-vis education? I mean, how can we change education to the extent that this becomes perfectly normal, that in fact communism and the history of communism is taught in schools? Do you see it happening ever?
I think it's possible. I mean, we have both in our lifetime seen the occasional thing that was thought impossible to actually happen in politics. And I think it is ultimately political. We do need a government to decide that this is wrong and to make, or people who have authority over the curriculum and setting the exams, we need them to perceive that there's a balance here that's not quite right, and to decide to do something about it. I think it's not impossible, and obviously I would like to have, if I had the funding, I would be setting up a section to try and achieve that, to try and change the curriculum, try and make sure that these subjects were studied, and to challenge some of the, what I would call, grey washing of the history of the Soviet Union that takes place currently.
Well, look, very, very best of luck with all of this, James. We actually have a few questions for our members, some exclusive content to ask you, so please stay with us. But for the time being, I would like to, before we sign off, I'd like you to tell us, how do people get to know more about what you're doing? The website you mentioned there, for example.
Yeah, so the website of the foundation is just www.historyoftotalitarianism.com.
Right.
That's where the essay prize is. And the Museum of Communist Terror is www.museumofcommunistterror.com.
Right.
And that has quite a lot of material on it. It has videos and briefs about various subjects, such as The Secret Speech by Khrushchev, which is a fascinating brief. And if I may say so, the best account you're going to get of the Cultural Revolution, with how Mao used it to destroy his rivals, that you're going to find on the internet.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. Thank you. That's it for this week. We will be back next week, so see you then on So What You're Saying Is. Thank you very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.